Welcome to the Mike White Podcast, where I, Mike White, share my conversations and book reviews through my journey to learn all that goes on in this amazing world. Buckle up and enjoy the ride. All right, welcome to the Mike White Podcast. So, I got another book review. I'm here in Kyoto, Japan, almost done with my 2-week trip out here. And so I thought the book reviews would be a great option. It's a lot more flexible, don't have to coordinate, and there's a lot of good books out there. So this one I recommend everyone picking up. It's called How to Lie with Statistics by Darrell Huff. This was actually written in 1954, so it's quite an old book. It's kind of funny to see, I don't know if funny is the right word, but interesting to see some of the things they refer to. And so like wages, for example, of what a high wage was back in the day and how nowadays like you could not live off that. So thanks inflation. But anyway, so this book was, I read it in high school. It was a summer reading requirement before AP Stats. That was definitely the best class I ever took in high school. AP Statistics. It was with Mr. Stern, and so I went to school in Frisco, Texas. There's a bunch of different high schools, and I actually had to get bused, me and this other guy, to a neighboring high school, Centennial, because there was only so many options there. So I'm really glad that like they actually let us do that and get us in this class, because this is like the basis for the math you use daily, and probably the most important math in life, in just everyday life, is statistics. But because of that, it's not just purely math. It's kind of an art form as well, because you can't just take everything as it is. You have to really evaluate the biases and what exactly the stat means. So this book dives into that. So like I said, it is written in 1954. It is pretty short. It took me probably 3 days of reading a couple hours every day, and I was taking notes. So definitely can be done in a week. I'll start with the introduction here. We'll just walk through the book. One of those examples that he has in the introduction is how susceptible people are to like news stories. So if you're not looking at the stats necessarily, but you're just looking at what's on TV or in the paper, people will think there's a lot of crime based on just the percentage of the paper that is filled with stories on crime. So his quote here is, it assumed that newspaper space given to crime reporting is a measure of crime rate. So that is something still very applicable today. Like, depending on people, just their bias, inherent bias, if they see a lot of it on TV, they think it's happening all the time. They don't look at the actual stats necessarily. And then, so that's just kind of introduction. He's talking about like the importance of the book. And then at the end there, it says, because the title is How to Lie with Statistics, so it's not meant to like teach people how to deceive others. But he says, the crooks already know these tricks. Honest men must learn them in self-defense. So it's important to know what type of lies people put out there. And this reminds me of Adam Carolla too. It's not always bad intent. A lot of people are just stupid, for lack of a better term. So Adam Carolla says stupid or liar. Like, do they really think that? Are they stupid, or are they trying to deceive you? Are they lying? So it's never abundantly clear on a case by case basis, but you should know when things are misleading. So chapter 1 is titled The Sample with Built-in Bias. So his example here is a study that reported on average income from Yale graduates. And so it had a very high number for average income for Yale graduates, saying like, oh, you should go to Yale because you'll get paid this much average income. So talks about here how reporting bias can be a thing. So if you're just send out a newsletter to all the graduates at Yale, you're not going to get every single person to answer to it. And the people that do answer are probably making more, that they have that inherent kind of ego or thing where they're more likely to report on it the more they make. So that skews the statistic there. And also the sampling procedure. So how are you going to sample? Like just setting out flyers and getting it back. There's a lot in how you actually choose your sample that can skew the statistic to represent something that's not what it actually is. All right, so more on that sample type thing is if you had to count a barrel of beans. So say you had a large barrel. So, and I forgot if it's the actual number or maybe like the number of black beans compared to brown beans. So if your sample is large enough and selected properly, it will represent the whole well enough for most purposes. But however, if you just take a handful, maybe that section is going to be like 90-10 black beans, but that is not, there's no reason to believe that is an actual representative sample of the whole barrel based on maybe how it was mixed or anything like that. When you have a small sample size, it is susceptible to not representing the whole, and not just small. So even if you have a large sample size, if it's not randomly selected or there's bias to it, it won't represent the whole properly. And then I remember, I forget, there's ways in this book is like definitely just high level, like, or abstract. I don't know about abstract, but it doesn't dive into the details. Like I remember in my actual statistics classes, they go into, okay, you need a sample size of at least this much, and this is your level of certainty. So he doesn't go into like actual evaluating all that. This is more of, hey, this is a way that they can fool you. So more on the Yale study. So the sample is of the addresses that are known, the people that are willing to say their income, that you're assuming that they're telling the truth. So the assuming that they're telling the truth, he relates it to a study about toothbrushing. If you ask people if they brush their teeth twice a day, a person might be embarrassed to say that they don't. So if you ask them directly, they probably be more likely to lie. So, quote, to be worth much, a report based on sampling must use a representative sample, which is one from which every source of bias has been removed. And it's very difficult and expensive to obtain a pure random sample. So just know that. All right, so that was a pretty hefty chapter, but it is a good one. Chapter 2 is more targeted towards one example of ways they can deceive you, and it's titled The Well-Chosen Average. So as you guys know, there's an average can be have multiple meanings. You got the mean, median, and mode. So depending on what they want to represent, whether it be their product or a study or what result they want, choosing that average can have a large impact. So always be weary of, are they choosing the mean? Are they choosing the median? A lot of cases, the median's probably the best, but those outliers, can have a large impact on the mean and make it seem like the average is a lot higher or lower than what you mostly see. All right, so chapter 3, the little figures that are not there. So this talks about sampling again, as well as some other factors of like charts and graphs. So his example is toothpaste with, it's saying they have, using this toothpaste, you'll get 23% fewer cavities for people that use this. And what they failed to mention in the large print is that this is based on a 12-person sample. So it's similar he relates it to flipping a coin to see if it's heads or tails. So it should be 50-50. But if you do it 10 times, it's likely, like, it may be 70-30 or 7-3. So you can't say that, like, this coin comes up heads 70% of the time. The sample is just way too small. You flip a coin 1,000,000 times, it's probably going to be damn near 50-50. The other thing he talks about is graphs. So graphs without labeled axes can really mean whatever. They can show whatever they want to show. You need the axes and the numbers to accurately see how it scales. Because a line with a small, tiny slope upward, if you zoom in enough, that slope can look pretty extreme. So that's a way that people can use graphs to deceive, is by not labeling the axes, or like chopping off parts of the graph to zoom in and make it look out of proportion. All right, so chapter 4, Much Ado About Practically Nothing. All right, so this one, he takes an example of these two people do IQ, want to measure intelligence, so they do IQ tests, and he starts off saying IQ test is probably a poor measure of intelligence, but just for the matter of argument, if you say IQ of greater than 100 is above average, or less than is average or below average, and these two people take the test, one gets 101, one gets 98, so you can't really say that one of them's above average and one's below, because you have the error, probable and standard error. And I haven't heard too much about the terms probable versus standard error. But so in this case, there really should be the average is this plus or minus this range. Because if you do it, 10 times, it's not like they're going to get 98 and 101 every single time. There's going to be some error to it. So he relates it to walking off 100 yards. So like at a football field, if you're just without any of the markers, if you wanted to see if you could walk off 100 yards, you would probably be off by a little bit every time. It's not like you'd get the exact spot every single time. So there'd be some error plus or minus this. So quote, "But comparisons between figures with small differences are meaningless. You must always keep that plus or minus in mind, even or especially when it is not stated." So really, that when you say 98 versus 101, if it's plus or minus 5 points, those are pretty much equivalent. So you have no real meaningful data from that. Chapter 5 is titled The Gee Whiz Graph. So he touched on this a little bit in the previous chapter, but in this case, he's talking about a national income graph and how much they can make the shape look differently to display their points. So initially they have like the zero line at the bottom with the y-axis, the income, and x-axis time. So over the last year, and it looks like it has a very small slope because it's proportional to from 0 to however much thousand, and it's pretty much the same. But when you zoom in, if you take out that zero line and you show the bottom of the graph maybe at 20,000, that makes the delta look much more extreme because it zoomed in like that. So if you wanted to portray a point saying, oh, the income's a lot higher, or look how much it raised in this year, that's one way they could do that, and it's the same graph. Then if you zoom in even more, it's even more extreme. So just ways you can mess with data display with the axes and labeling on graphs. All right, so chapter 6 is titled The One-Dimensional Picture. So this is more kind of graphical deception. It talks about pictographs and bar charts. So I don't see pictographs much at all, if ever. But in his case, this one was like a bag of money, to a pictograph to show how much more money one country has than the other. And the way they did this was they made the bag 2 times higher, but they also made it 2 times wider. So if you think of it, looking at the picture, it looks much more than 2 times higher. So it's the little art of deception, because of, the actual surface area is 4 times. And if you look at the volume, then it would be 8 times. So they can kind of mess with pictographs in that way. And he just has a bunch of examples of those in this chapter. Chapter 7 is titled The Semi-Attached Figure. So, quote, "If you can't prove what you want to prove, demonstrate something else and pretend they are the same thing." So this is a very dangerous one, and I think this is one of the more commonly used things. So here's another quote. "You can't prove that your nostrum cures colds, but you can publish in large type a sworn laboratory report that half an ounce of the stuff killed 31,108 germs in a test tube in 11 seconds. So this one directly, if you look at today, on every Germex or Purell hand sanitizer thing, it says kills 99.9% of germs, any cleaning supplies. But that's different than saying makes you 99.9% safer from disease, let's say. Because really, you may be better off if you didn't use Purell. Maybe those germs and all that stuff you're so scared of actually helps your immune response. I don't think it's clear cut. I think I've seen studies where the more Purell people use, the more they get sick. So some people may say, oh, because of this, you should use Purell more because it kills all these germs. But that's equating 2 different things. All we're looking at is the germs. But then you're trying to use that to equate to sickness and health. So that sickness and health thing has to have its own dedicated study to measure that. You can't just base it off germs. So that's another Adam Carolla thing that made me think of him, because he's always ranting about everyone in the Purell craze. This was before COVID. Just all the moms just lathering their kids in Purell all the time is probably not a great thing. Another example is a juicer. So there's a juicing machine. It says that will give them 26% more juice, but it doesn't say compared to what. So it's not compared to the leading competitor. This is compared to the manual juice methods. So that's really not helpful when you're trying to figure out, which juicer should I buy? All that's kind of helpful is saying a juicer will be better than you doing it by hand. Another example, is talking about the Navy death rate during the Spanish-American War is lower than the civilians in New York City. So the Navy was using that as a recruiting tool. It's like, hey, join the Navy. You'll be safer than if you were a regular civilian in New York City. Less people, there's a lower death rate at the war than in the city. But what this fails to mention is, the military age people are much healthier than the average population. So that stat of New York City accounts for all the infants. And then this time, infants actually had a higher mortality risk. This was in the 50s, right? So this wasn't super advanced medicine. It grouped in old people. So really, you need to be looking at the death rate of those military-aged people and compare that to the death rate of the Spanish-American War to have a somewhat accurate comparison. and you're probably more likely to die in war at that age than just living in the States. All right, so also another example. So he's full of examples in this one. So 1952 was the worst polio year in medical history, and that's based on the polio cases. So, but this doesn't mean that polio is necessarily worse. So it fails to mention or that more children in 1952 were at the most susceptible age for polio. Also, the general the consciousness of polio was leading to more frequent diagnoses and recording of mild cases. So this might sound familiar with COVID. So I'm sure stuff like this could happen today. So I'm not saying it did or any of that, but you have to look at it and you have to be healthily skeptical of these numbers and try to think of what types of biases may or may not be in the numbers. Also, there was an increased financial incentive. So there's more polio insurance and more aid available. So again, this is not saying that there's bad actors in play, but anytime there's incentives, it's more likely that thing incentivized will happen. So you have to think about what possible biases there are and take that into consideration. So these are all just possible, right? Possible places of bias. But what he says is the total number of deaths confirm the doubt of it being the worst year for polio. So while the cases were very high, the actual deaths was low. So it's if the deaths were also high, then yeah, that would be an indicator that polio was really bad in 52. So quote, "It is an interesting fact that the death rate or number of deaths often is a better measure of the incidence of an ailment than direct incidence figures." So get some more controversy in this episode. So this reminds me, you could say COVID, but this reminds me of climate alarmists or climate change people. So I'm not saying that humans don't have an impact. I'm not saying that at all. But what I am saying is people need to look at this issue differently. We are safer than we have ever been in terms of being susceptible to the environment. I see nature is not just the perfect situation. This unimpacted nature is not a great place to live. It is very dangerous. And humans have to alter nature in order to survive and to thrive and to flourish. So I would say we are living in one of the better environments in all of our lifetime, because the climate, you look at climate-related deaths, is a powerful statistic to me. Climate-related deaths have plummeted, and that's not because we're not impacting nature. It's because we are impacting nature. We're making the world a safer place for humans. So people are so caught up on this CO2 number and this temperature number, but they are not questioning, is that an actual safer place for humans? What is the actual downside of that? Is that bad? So that's what that reminded me of. So the whole fossil fuels debate and the energy debate, super dense. It probably deserves a whole episode, and that would be fun to have someone with maybe some conflicting viewpoints. But I would recommend, if anyone wants to read more about how I think about that, or if they're like totally up in arms and think I'm crazy and I'm going to kill the world, read Fossil Future by Alex Epstein. He makes the case of why we should not try to rapidly eliminate fossil fuels, and makes the case of you got to look at the argument or the issue in a larger picture of and base it on human flourishing, not necessarily non-impact. Like this delicate nature, like ideal non-impact goal is not a healthy goal to have. So Fossil Future by Alex Epstein. Also, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels was his first book he wrote years ago. It's also a good one, but Fossil Future is kind of his latest and greatest. It's dense, but it's very good. All right, so back to How to Lie with Statistics. Chapter 8, Post Hoc Rides Again. So this chapter is talking about how correlation does not equal causation. So his example, they have a study that smoking is correlated with low grades. So, smoking is, the people that smoke also have low grades, so the smoking must be giving them bad grades. Or is it people that get bad grades, it causes them to smoke? So it's just saying that just because things are correlated doesn't mean there's a causal relationship between the two. Bunch of different examples in here. He says they could be correlated by chance. So this can be true, especially with a small sample size. So if you do a study with a small sample size enough and just throw out all the tries that you don't get your correlation, you'll eventually find one where it's correlated, and they could use that one. So that's one. Another thing is the relationship is real, but it is impossible to be sure which of the variables is the cause and which is the effect. So his example here is income and stock ownership were correlated. So the more people made, the more it corresponded with more stock ownership. So does that mean that if you make more, you'll own more stock, or does that mean if you own more stock, you'll make more? You don't really know. Another thing he says is option is neither has any effect at all on the other, yet there is a real correlation. So that's the example of grades and cigarettes. So there is some third thing that, or more, it doesn't have to be just another thing, but there is a relationship, but neither really affect the other. All right, so chapter 9 is titled How to Statisticate. He made up that word. So he defines that word. I'm not going to try to say it again, but that is misinforming people by the use of statistical material. So this reminds me of like the whole stupid or liar thing. Are people really bad actors, or are they just seeing the numbers or seeing the stats and making bad assumptions from those? Like one study, he talked about how the person calculated average family income. So the way he did this was he took the total income of America or the area and divided it by the number of people. So that was the income per person. And then he multiplied it by 4 because the average family had 4 people. So right then you could see that's not a very useful average at all. So maybe he thought that was a good way to do it. Who knows? But for any meaningful purpose, that is not a good average. Other ways is percentages. So people not understanding how percentages work. If something goes up by 100%, it doubles, right? But if it goes down by 100%, you lose everything. Or if you lose something if it goes down by 50%, it's going to have to increase by 100% to go back to where it was. People adding percentages together instead of, multiplying it twice. Like if you had something that's 20% off and then it's another 70% off, it's not like it's 90% off. I don't see this too often. I think most people know this, hopefully. Hopefully the schools have taught people how to do math, but you never know, and it's a easy mind trick if you do not really think about percentages. All right, quote, "The fact is that despite its mathematical base, statistics is as much an art as it is a science." So just like we're talking about all the biases involved, this, how you're going to sample, there's so much thought that has to be put into how this statistic was formed, and you can't just take it off of face value. All right, quote, "This suggests giving statistical material, the facts and figures in newspapers and books, magazines and advertising, a very sharp second look before accepting any of them. Sometimes a careful squint will sharpen the focus, but arbitrarily rejecting statistical methods makes no sense either. That is like refusing to read because writers sometimes use words to hide facts and relationships rather than to reveal them." So he's stressing here, like, don't just dismiss stats. Stats have a useful purpose. Just make sure that it is a proper stat and it's well formed and useful. All right, so last chapter, chapter 10, titled "How to Talk Back to a Statistic." Quote, "You can prod the stuff with 5 simple questions, and by finding the answers, avoid learning a remarkable lot that isn't so." All right, so his 5 questions are: who says so? How does he know? What's missing? Did somebody change the subject? And does it make sense? So who says so? Is there a bias? How does he know? So sample bias specifically, is it a large enough sample? What's missing? So watch out for unspecified averages. Are there percentages without raw figures, or vice versa? Did somebody change the subject? So example here is 500,000 more farms in 1935 than 5 years earlier. And in this stat, they don't mention that, the definition of a farm had changed. So this is very applicable today when you talk about inflation, how CPI is used to state inflation. It's constantly changing. They're constantly trying to find new ways to measure it. And I mean, I'm not saying those people that do that are have bad intent, but I'm sure that they want to make inflation look less than it actually is. I'm pretty sure. It would surprise me if that was not the case. And so one way they do that is changing how they measure it. So be careful of that. And inflation in general, just kind of a tangent there. It's not CPI is a kind of a crazy way to measure it anyway, because the basket of goods that is used for CPI may not be is not the same for every family. Every family kind of has their own inflation. So talking about Bitcoin, Michael Saylor talks a lot about this. He was the CEO of MicroStrategy, and now he's pretty much purely in Bitcoin and researching, advocating for Bitcoin. He talks about how there needs to be like a vector. Inflation is a vector. It's way too simplified to just use this basket of goods and say this applies to everyone. Much more complex. All right, so then the last question is, does it make sense? One thing he mentions here is the dangers of extrapolation. So this example was like TVs per household or the population in general. So if you look at a small stretch of years when TVs started becoming more and more prominent, they were skyrocketing. Like there's way more TVs getting introduced. The rate was insane. And if you extrapolated that and think, it's just going to be linear for the next 50 years, your number would be totally wrong. It would be way too high. So you can't extrapolate. Just because something has been that way before doesn't mean that it will be that way in the future. So Moore's Law, for example, to think that we're going to constantly make transistors smaller, like have them every year, smaller and smaller and smaller, like eventually it's got to level off at some point. Like this exponential growth, I'd be shocked if it continued. Or population growth, right? So like freaking China made this mistake. And they were all worried about this rapid population growth. So they implemented the one child policy and like, oh, we have to stop this. And I mean, who knows what if they didn't. I'll just say, like, I think that's a terrible policy and like the government has no business in that. But just in general, if you think, oh, the population is always going to grow at this rate, you'd find yourself to be wrong at some point. Like, you cannot extrapolate given a small sector to think, oh, this is always how it's going to be in the future. All right, guys. So that wraps it up for my review. I just went chapter by chapter. I really think it's a good book. Everyone should read it just so they have that healthy skepticism. Not that you should reject statistics completely. It's very powerful math. And I think quite the opposite. You should try to hone in your understanding of stats, and it will help with risk assessment because nothing is certain. And that's one thing you learn in stats. Like, there's barely anything that's a zero probability. So let me know what you guys think, and go pick up a copy of How to Lie with Statistics. See ya. Thank you for listening to the Mike White Podcast. Be sure to follow us on Instagram and TikTok at Mike White Pod, and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Y'all have a great day.